If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Well, welcome, Ed. We have a really interesting episode today because we're launching a new club.
It's so exciting.
It's so exciting.
And right now it only has 2 members.
But you got to do your NPR voice. It's so
right.
exciting. It's so exciting. But we're so excited. So a number of months back, 6 months or so ago, Corey and I started Book Club.
Right.
We've had our Book Club episodes where we talk about Catholic novels.
And I like those. I've read a couple of them.
Yeah. But you've been sitting on the sidelines, maybe having a little bit of club envy.
I want a club.
You wanted a club. So I thought, man, what we'll do is we'll start, because you and I have always watched movies.
Right.
As long as I've known you, we love movies. Corey's not really a movie guy.
Right.
I love Corey. He's a book guy, but he's not really a movie guy.
Right.
And you and I are a little bit more like pop culture,
right.
folks. And we can sort of dial into sitting in the movie theater, eating a giant tub of popcorn and watching a good movie, which we've done. We've spent untold hours doing. And we actually did a movie review on the podcast when we did the movie review this summer of Father Stew.
Right.
And so after that, we were like, we should do more Catholic movies. So henceforth, from this point onward, Ed and I have Movie Club, and we're going to bring that to all of you listeners. We're going to talk about classic Catholic movies, and if there's any new Catholic movies that pop up like Father Stew, we'll do those.
Right.
But from time to time, we're going to talk about classic Catholic movies. Today, we're going to kick off with what I consider to be one of the greatest of all Catholic movies of the last 50, 100 years, and that is The Mission, 1986 film. Robert DeNiro, Jeremy Irons, and a Liam Neeson who looks 20 years old. Right. And it's actually been recognized. It won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, which is like, the highest prize at the Cannes Film Festival in 86. It won the Academy Award for Best Cinematography. And I remember when it came out, I was in seminary. I'll give people a sense of how old I am. But, it has been recognized. It was a big film. And a lot of people in churches, not just Catholic churches, loved the movie because of its religious or Christian themes in general.
Right.
And it's listed on every kind of, Catholic film list. In fact, the Vatican has a list of, on some part of its website or something, Catholic films, and it's listed as one of the 15 Catholic films that the Vatican points to.
Right.
And I love this movie. I've seen this movie dozens and dozens of times over the years. In fact, way back, you and I were talking before we started recording, way back when I was, before I was Catholic, and when the movie came out in the late 80s, through the 90s, early 2000s, when I was doing student ministry, I used to show this movie. I'd invite people over to my house or whatever, and for ministry groups, Bible studies, and I'd show the movie, and then we'd talk about it. Did that with college students.
Right.
And I always thought, man, we got to watch this. This is going to be great. And it was always interesting when we turned it off, their reactions, because a lot of them didn't like it. I've had a lot of people over to my house, and we set up popcorn or whatever, and we show this. And I'm going to show you, and this they intentionally came for a Bible study. We're going to have a Christian film night, and I show it. I used to show it, and when I was over, I turned the lights back on with all these university students or whatever, and I go, "What do you think?" And about half of them were like, didn't get it, didn't like it,
right?
And like, why are you so into this? Because we aren't. And I think that, for me, when it first came out and I first saw it, I was so attracted to the vision and the themes and what was going on in this film. Of course, I was an evangelical, I was a Protestant. I think it was the Catholicism in it that I think at that point I was already on a road to Rome without knowing it. And I didn't know, I didn't have the vocabulary to explain what was going on in the film. And because I just didn't have the Catholic vocabulary yet. But I was like, whatever that is, that's like
Right.
kind of a vision of Christianity that I'm really attracted to. And it's only now in retrospect that I can sort of look back at that and go, I was drawn to the Catholicism in it, even though I didn't really at that time completely understand
Right.
that it was, what the Catholicism was. And I think that was exactly what repelled a lot of my,
Yeah.
people that came over for Bible studies and Catholic, or film, Christian film night or whatever, is because they were turned off by the Catholicism of the movie. So all that being said, you had never seen the movie. So we got together and had a pizza last week, and I said, we're going to start movie club. And the first one we're going to start with is The Mission, and let's rent it and watch it. So you rented it and watched it the other night, and you are now going to tell us what you thought. Well, first of all, I've been talking too much. First of all, let's summarize the film real quick.
Yeah.
You got to get a word in edgeways here. Real quick, for those of you who have not seen it, this movie's been around 40 years. Here's the gist of it. It occurs in the 1750s in South America, a little kind of corner where Argentina and Paraguay sort of meet and Brazil meet. And at that time, the Spanish and the Portuguese were the two, nations or empires that sort of owned that area. And the Spanish territory bumped up against the Portuguese territory, right, in this region. And the Spanish, at that time, slavery was technically illegal under the Spanish crown. But in Portugal, slavery was legal. And so what was happening is they were contending over this region because under the Portuguese, the slave traders could capture these Indians. And the Spanish, they couldn't. So there was this big complicated thing about real life, Treaty of Madrid, all this sort of thing about who would own this territory up in the mountains in South America. And meanwhile, the Jesuit missionaries had built a series of missions up in the mountains and to reach the Indians. And as long as these Indians were sort of under the protection of the Jesuit missionaries and these missions, the Portuguese couldn't capture them and make them slaves because if they're Christians and they're part of the missions, right?
Right.
So all this political pressure is brought to bear in Europe between Spain and Portugal. The church is caught in the middle. What is it going to do? And the gist of the film, that's what the film was about, is in the end, the Portuguese go up there and they wipe out the mission and capture, try to capture the natives. Now, in the film, there is Jeremy Irons, who is the Jesuit superior there. It's the kind of top Jesuit priest.
Right.
And he's kind of running this. He's got a number of others. And he sort of established the mission really great. And then there's the Robert DeNiro character, who is a mercenary and a slave trader. Well, what ends up happening, of course, is, but he ends up murdering his own brother in an argument over a woman. And he's then distraught by that. He's been arrested. Technically, actually, because it was a duel, he's, free to go. But he wants to die because he killed his own brother. Jeremy Irons, the Jesuit priest, comes to him and says, well, you can do a penance. And the penance is, you can describe what happens pretty quick. But he ends up having to go up and help serve the mission and serve the Indians, which he was formerly a slave trader to. And the course of that, he sort of goes through a life change. He himself becomes a Jesuit priest.
Right.
And after he becomes a Jesuit priest, things are going well up in the mission. And then that's when the Portuguese army comes in to wipe out the mission. And then these two priests, Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, they both have to decide how they're going to react. Robert De Niro wants to revert to his old ways.
Right.
Find his armor, find his weapons, train the Indians, lead them to resist violently, to expel the Portuguese who are trying to kill them. Jeremy Irons says, no, we have to be true to Christ. And if we're to be martyred, we're to be martyred. And in the end, they both die very different deaths. Robert De Niro dies a violent death fighting the people trying to destroy the Indian missions. And Jeremy Irons dies leading, mass and a adoration and and dies as a martyr. And so one is left at the end of the film going, who made the right decision? So anyway, I've been talking for like 10 minutes. I'm done. You saw the film. You talk now.
Well, you talked about seeing it when you were younger and some people not liking it. And and not having, not being a Catholic, you didn't really have even like a vocabulary for how to talk about this. If I had seen this movie, even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, I would have thought, oh, come on. Why does Robert De Niro have to do this horrible penance? And why couldn't you just this or that, and why would you volunteer to suffer? What's wrong with you? What kind of religion is that? And I've lived in the Protestant world, it's sort of a culture of, and more and more and more and more lately, a culture of winning, a culture of blessing, I have plans for you to prosper. Everyone's got that verse up on their wall. But the definition of prosperity, now that I understand Catholicism better, it feels like the Catholic definition of prosperity is different. And how am I, so as it relates to the movie, these men were the priest, Jeremy Irons, the head guy. He was giving himself away for this. And I don't know if this is really a thought just struck me, so maybe it's wrong. Yeah, get cards and letters. But in the Protestant world, the missionaries are the ones who do that, but nobody else.
Right.
Giving things up for God. Well, you don't have to do that. God is here to bless you, right? So the big moving scene for me, excuse me, was De Niro is the guy who kills his brother, and he's obviously now feeling remorse for all the things he's done. He's like, okay, I'm just a bad guy, right? So Jeremy Irons, the priest, the penance he assigns him is to bundle up his armor in a big net and tie a rope around his neck and his shoulders, and he has to drag this thing all the way to the mission.
Way up in the mountains.
He's got to climb a cliff in the jungle and all that stuff.
And it's like something from Dante, right? I mean, he's got this giant, 400-pound thing of, metal and armor banging behind him, and he's trying to climb his way up these mountain cliffs and jungle. He's determined
to do it, I think, obviously in the movie, because he just feels like, I have to do something to say I'm sorry. I have to, and so and at one point, the priest played by Liam Neeson cuts it loose from him because he can't stand it anymore and thinks that De Niro has done enough. And De Niro the thing splashes back down in the river, and he goes down there and he ties it around his neck again and he climbs up. And when he gets to the top, he's exhausted. And these natives who live in the mission now.
Before you tell that story, when he does, the one, as you said, the Liam Neeson character, who is one of the Jesuits, cuts him free, and he says to Jeremy Irons, the Jesuit superior, he goes, he's done enough.
Right.
And Jeremy Irons says, until he believes he's done enough,
right,
the penance isn't over. And I just want to say something real quick about that, because when I saw it, and as a Protestant, and then I showed it to so many Protestants, they didn't get it. And I can understand it more. And I think this is really the nature of penance, right? So I think that from the Protestant standpoint, you go, well, isn't it enough that he just sort of accepts Jesus, says he's sorry, and then can move on? And Jeremy Irons says he's got to be a penance hard enough for him to feel. And this goes to the issue of what penance is, right? Like, so I went to confession yesterday. I go into and I have, make my confession, and then the priest gives me absolution. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then he gives me penance. And I think it's important that absolution comes before the penance. So I don't have to go out and do these things, report back to the priest and say, okay, I did my assignments. Now can I be forgiven? I'm forgiven, but the penance is on the back side of that, because there's a sense in which, in a sense in which penance is medicinal.
Right.
Right. So we've talked about this, many times, the difference in the podcast, we've talked about the difference between salvation and sanctification, right? And that we're saved only by, the grace of Christ, but we're sanctified, we're made holy. We cooperate in that. Right. And maybe another way to think of that is, forgiveness and healing, to heal my soul. There's a medicinal quality. So after I left the confessional, I was assigned a penance, and I went and did my penance. And in a sense, I think it's interesting. What Father asked me to do was there was a particular Bible passage he wanted me to spend some time reflecting on.
Mm-hmm.
So when I did that, I realized that this was medicinal in a sense.
Right.
Father wanted me to dwell in this passage, from Scripture, and in a sense to have some healing and to let some things go. And so anyway, I think I just wanted to interrupt there only because I think that whole part of the film where he's dragging the armor up into the jungle and he's doing this kind of thing, it's almost kind of crazy from Dante, this sort of extreme penance. And that's the part that so many Protestants couldn't relate to in the film. I think it's a wonderful illustration, and it had to be hard. Jeremy Irons says it has to be hard enough for him to believe that God has forgiven him.
Right. And I would not have understood that 2 years ago. And I would have thought that this was a perfect example of a Catholic working his way to his salvation, working for his salvation. And I understand that difference now.
Now, you said when they finally get to the top and he comes dragging the armor into the Indian village, you were going to...
Okay, so by the way, I've been waiting, and it's never happened, for the priest to give you a penance of buying me another pizza. That would be like, I think you should buy Ed a pizza. That's right. Poor guy. So he gets to the top, and these tribesmen come out, and they know who he is. They've watched him steal some of their fellow tribesmen, right? And they have every reason to hate him and every reason to want him dead, but they've been converted. And one of the guys runs over with his knife to DeNiro, who is now so exhausted he can just sit there. Plus, he won't defend himself because he thinks there's no defense for what he's done. And the native, Jeremy Irons, says, no, somebody's going to go over there and stop the guy. And Irons says, no, just let it play out. And the guy goes over there, and instead of killing DeNiro, which I think is what the DeNiro's character expected, it's like, okay, well, here it comes, right? Instead, he cuts the burden free. He cuts the ropes from the guy as if to say, we forgive you. We know what you did, but that's not how we are anymore. And DeNiro's character just sits and sobs. And then so did I, sitting there in the living room. Like, I'm looking out the neighbors. Can the neighbors see this? It was an extremely moving moment. It's just a beautiful picture of forgiveness.
Well, yeah. And the way that, as you say, there's the dynamic there that the Indian cuts that armor free, then in a sense, this is him going to the people he's wronged. Whenever we sin against God ultimately. But I also, so if I bonk you in the head and take your car keys, right? If I lift your wallet, I've sinned against God, but I've also sinned against you. And there's a sense in which God can forgive me, but I also need to be reconciled to you. And there's a sense in which I hope that you will forgive me. I mean, this is a part of, those people who've been through the 12-step program, right? I can't remember which one of the steps is because I've never been through it, but I understand that part of that process is you go out and find the people that you have wronged and try to seek their forgiveness, right? And so in a sense, at that point, the DeNiro character has been absolved by God. He's done this penance to work off in a sort of medicinal way, work off that sense of his own personal guilt. But then when he gets to the Indians, and that's just the drama, cuts the thing, cuts the rope and takes all of his armor and his weapons and everything, and it hurtles down some cliff into the water, that the Indians, in a sense, have not only forgiven him, but cut loose that part of his life, cut loose his sin.
His sin has been cast into the river.
Yeah.
And not to see it anymore. I would not, it was a foreign thought to me. When you and I went and saw Father Stu, he meets this beautiful young woman, and she wants to marry him, and then he decides to become a priest. And I thought, this guy is out of his mind. This is a true story. Look at that woman. Why couldn't you could have it all? You could just be a Protestant minister. What's the matter with you? You could be a Protestant minister. And then, he gets sick and he's going to not live very long, and he has a good attitude about it. And I'm thinking, maybe a case could be made that I've suffered in my life. I don't know. But I've never thought, oh, good, or this is God doing something in me. I'm always trying to get out from underneath it, right? And so this is just such a different thing. So whoever would lose his life, save his life, must lose it. And blessed are the poor, and blessed are you when you're persecuted. That's all sort of fairly new territory for me. I never hear that talked about. I've rarely heard that talked about in Protestant sermons or anything, right? We didn't all sit around saying, "Hey, how were you persecuted today?" Or how was,
Right. And I think there's two dimensions to this. One is, we could talk about doctrinal differences between Catholics and Protestants on this, but we can also sort of talk about a pastoral approach, right? Or a discipleship approach, because there's a sense in which the evangelical Protestant mindset so embraces the freedom that Christ brings, which he does, and Catholics don't disagree with that, right? But it sort of quickly leaps to, that's in my past, right?
Right.
And for those of you who are listening, going, wait a minute, are you saying the Catholics don't? Just hold on, let me finish, right? That, for example, why do Catholics have crucifixes, which has the corpus, the body of Jesus hanging from it, and Protestants have empty crosses, right? And what Protestants want to emphasize in that is the cross is empty because there has been a once and for all payment of our sins, and now the suffering of Christ is sort of in the rearview mirror, as are my sins, and I'm dwelling on the forgiveness side of that. In Catholicism, there is that reflection on the sufferings of Christ that you see not only every time you look at a crucifix, when you look at when we do the Stations of the Cross in Lent, right? There's always that sense of, in a sense, being united with Christ in his suffering, which is completely scriptural. Paul says, "I want to be united with Christ in his suffering, so that I'll be united with him in his life." And there's a sense in which, again, I'm not even trying to make a doctrinal point about this, but sort of a pastoral point, that notion of sort of carrying a cross, being one with Christ in his suffering, in a sense, bearing those. I mean, look at the ultimate Catholic saints, Saint Francis of Assisi and, Padre Pio, whatever. They bore the stigmata. Right? The marks of Christ on their body, right? So the nail marks of Christ, in them.
Right.
And that's that identification. You never hear a Protestant say, "I have the stigmata," or that would be a sign of whatever. Because why would I do that? Why would I be bound to that? So you're right. There's something profoundly Catholic in all of this of wanting to enter into suffering.
Well, you said to me when you were buying me a pizza last week, even though a priest didn't tell you to, or even suggest it.
I did it not as a penance, not because I had to, because I wanted to.
Oh, so okay.
I'm a river to my people.
I laughed about that over and over. Okay. Anyway, you said that we were talking about suffering and bearing up under it, and you said, well, it's like you didn't reference this scripture verse, but it's like, if any father who loves his child will discipline that child. And it's like God's trusting you enough to give you suffering. It's a gift. I'll put a plug in for the blog in case any of you listeners are not reading the blog. There's some stuff there. Extra.
A lot of great stuff that Ed writes and Corey write.
Yeah, Well, thank you. I just did a blog post, 10 things I like about being Catholic.
Yeah,
and one of them was, I think about Catholicism. I am not yet a Catholic. And one of them was that in the Protestant church, they're always telling me I'm okay.
Right.
But I always have this nagging feeling that I'm not. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not okay. But I think what I'm seeing in Catholicism is this. Yes, you may be okay, and the blood of Jesus covers you. And yes, but you shouldn't just assume it. I need to think about it, and it strikes me that the penance would help me to understand the gravity of sinning and not just say, well, yeah, but Jesus' blood covers it, so hey, I'm good. It's a little more serious and weighty than that.
Yeah.
I just would not have seen or understood that 3 or 4 years ago.
So what else struck you about the film?
I did struggle a little bit with the Catholic hierarchy in the movie seeming to just to not care about what happened to these people at the mission. And I know that the cardinal who in the movie had a terrible time with it and really wrestled with it. But in the end, he rubber stamped what it was that his bosses were telling him to do, knowing that it would bring misery to these people. And I struggled with that. It was kind of like the my old Protestant dismissal of Catholicism as just being this giant hierarchy where, and in the end, I understood, as I thought about it later after the movie, I thought, well, okay, look, there was probably not a whole lot the church could have done. This was being done. The people who came in and in the end and destroyed the mission weren't the Catholics. These were the Portuguese. They were the ones doing wrong, not the Catholics, and it wasn't Spain. But that, I struggled a little bit with that.
Yeah, and that's a common reaction to this film. And I just want to address it because we could go for half an hour onto the history of this whole thing. And, the 1750s, like all history and all periods, was super complicated. I mean, you were in the... You think about what's going on in the 1750s, this is the ramp up to the American Revolution, almost to the, 20 years short of that. So 1758 when the events took place. So 18 years before the American Revolution, right? For the French Revolution, another 5 years, 6 years later. And so, Europe is in this, complete kind of meltdown, cauldron of politics and war. And the church is not in a strong position in Europe in the mid 18th century. In the French Revolution, the church would be devastated in France. Priests killed, churches burned. Right, the desecration. Napoleon went and captured the Vatican and arrested the Pope and put him in exile. So the church was not in a strong position, and the politics of the day were very, very complicated. And essentially, a war was going to start between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Right. The church is in the middle, and if and I think the film does portray, as you said, the cardinal who's sort of a papal ambassador here, legate or whatever, that, he's in this difficult position because he's got to do what he's going to do. Otherwise, the Portuguese are going to simply wipe out all of the churches and the Catholic Church is, going to be decimated. So what do you do? Yeah. Unless the Catholic, priests are going to take up arms. And that's exactly what some of them did in the end of the film, right? So DeNiro and Liam Neeson and a couple of these other guys decide to take up arms and fight. But short of them taking up arms and fighting, I think that was the essence of the film. What are they supposed to do? Right. Jeremy Irons' character gathers, the Indians and the church up in the mountains, and they have mass and adoration. They're going to have a Eucharistic procession, and they're going to accept death joyfully as martyrs. Right. And some of the priests decide to take up arms, literally take up weapons, and fight the Portuguese back. But the church was in a terrible situation, and I think that's one of the reasons why I've always liked the film, and I've liked showing the film to groups and then turn the lights on and have a discussion, because you go, well, okay, today now, 300 years later, it's not those sets of issues, but the church is caught in some very, very complicated positions in the world. Right. We think about the United States, whether it's abortion or it's euthanasia or it's, the LGBTQ gender stuff or whatever else it is. But there's parts of the world, China, repressive parts of the world, where the church is in very, very difficult situations, and the politics of it are very, very difficult. And I'm not, making an excuse for it all, but I think what it does is the film is an occasion to say, well, how do we handle and how should the church and how should Christians act when these kinds of things are going on? What should the church have done during World War II when the Nazis were rounding up the Jews? Well, in reality, the church hit a lot of them. We're going to talk about The Sound of Music as one of our movie club and classically the nuns take the distributor wires off the thing at the end of the movie, and help the Van Trapp family escape over the mountains, There were Jews that were hid in the Vatican. The church did, some churchmen didn't. Some and a whole nother story when we get into that. A lot of church people, churchmen, a lot of the hierarchy were involved in resistance movements against Hitler. And so the only point I'm trying to make is I think the film illustrates that the church is going to find itself in these difficult quandaries at different points in history. Right. And not only is the church sort of hierarchy going to have to decide how to wrestle with that, but we as individual Christians at times are going to have to decide, what do we do? Right. It now occurs to me, I have a horrible thought.
I'm going to have to watch The Sound of Music. And then those songs are going to be stuck in my head.
In your head, yes.
Because they've been in my head all my life. You can't get away from them. Okay, another thing entirely. Jeremy Irons he risks his life to approach these natives because a former priest had gone there and they had killed him. Mm-hmm. So he starts this mission. Now it's years later, and he's not only taught them how to be Christians, but he's taught them cultural European things. Right. They're singing European music and they're playing European instruments and so forth. And the popular approach to this is the cultural approach to this, I think nowadays is, well, why would you want to bring that? Why do you have to bring that culture to them? Yeah. Why do you have to bring, why can't you just
cultural colonialism?
Yeah. Why can't, and I, as I watched, I thought, well, okay, but two things. These are good things that they brought. The music is good. I would make a case that it was better than the music they were making, whatever it was, higher, I think it was. But it was also a way in to Catholicism for them. It was something that they could attach to. And I ended up thinking, well, I guess I don't have a problem with it.
So, I mean, I'm so glad you brought this up. You know, what the film reflects was a period in history, and I hope that it's not gone, in which for, 1900 years, the church was confident that in its culture and it was bringing that culture to the world. The church had confidence at teaching, reading and writing and music and organizing things and bringing, the church had something to offer to the world. It was that synthesis. And for those who would say, well, all you're doing is bringing white Europeanism, I mean, I just would smack back at that argument. Look, the Catholicism has always been a synthesis. That's what it means to be Catholic universal.
Right.
I open this podcast every episode by saying, 20 centuries, 24 time zones, right? 2 hemispheres, people from every tribe, language, nation. That's Catholicism. So Catholicism isn't, 17th century Belgian culture.
Right.
It is the amalgamation, if that's a word, right? The cumulative culture that goes all the way back to the 1st century in Palestine and Syria and Asia Minor and the Romans and the Greeks and all of those things that have been added. And what you really have in Catholic culture, and those missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries went into China and Japan and all around the world, and for hundreds and centuries and centuries spread this Catholic civilization, which really is a civilization made up of the accumulation of 2,000 years of cultures and peoples. And so the church was confident that it had something to offer. And there's a line in there when the Portuguese are coming and whatnot, that one of the Indians says, we came out of the jungle into the mission because the devil is in the jungle. And and God brought us to the mission to bring us into light.
Right.
And, that moved me. And that's what it was. Now, of course, all this is decried as cultural colonialism. And what you should do is leave them, in the jungle.
What this argument comes down to, it seems to me, ultimately is that nothing is intrinsically better or more beautiful or more good or more true than anything else. That no music is better than all music, no matter who makes it or what they do. And then, so what you end up with is like the drum circle at Venice Beach. That's right. People talk, somebody was telling me about the drum circles at Venice Beach. And one time when I was out touristing there, I saw a drum circle and I wandered over and watched for a while, and I thought, what a bunch of no talent.
Oh, dude, I don't even have, I don't have time on this podcast to talk about that.
But there isn't.
That I attended and was educated at was the University of Colorado in Boulder. And Boulder, when I was there, was a hippy-dippy, university. And I was studying philosophy at Boulder. And I remember sitting in graduate seminars in philosophy on a warm day on the 2nd floor of this building, and outside are the hippie drum circles. And the Hare Krishnas chanting Hare Hare, Krishna Krishna. And, it's just a kind of crazy thing to be in that sort of syncretic environment and trying to be doing a Christian apologetics. And I used to get it every day, that this kind of moral relativism, cultural relativism. But the truth is that this movie I think does capture that one-time sense that the church had and the Jesuit missions had, that they went, whether it was China or Japan or Paraguay or whatever in Africa, and they continued to push the boundaries of civilization out there. And I just flat out reject the we don't have time for this now, but just reject the sort of cultural and moral relativism that would impugn that. So. Right.
And I'm not saying that you can't get wonderful, beautiful, and good things out of any culture. I'm not saying that, but there was beautiful things are beautiful things.
Yeah. Well, and that's the point. That's that synthesis of all of those civilizations and all those cultures and all those people.
I don't think I have any other big thoughts about this movie.
So I'm looking at the time. We're going to wrap this up here. I want to end with two quick thoughts. Earlier we were saying that the Indian kind of cut DeNiro's armor loose and it falls into the river, which was symbolic of his sin being cut loose and tossed. But then when they hear that the army is coming back, De Niro decides to renounce his vows as a priest. And it's interesting because he goes back down to the river to get the armor.
Right.
And so that's obviously, clearly a reference or an actual instance of him going back to his old life, his old sins. Right. I'm going to go dredge that back up. I'm going to go take up the things that had been cut loose and rely on those again. And so I think there was just a real moment here that all of us have as Christians, whether it's Catholic or not, as Christians, where we have to go at a certain point as we progress in our discipleship, where do we leave those things behind, or where do we go back and rely on them? And then the other thing is, of course, what the movie leaves you with in the end, in the final scene, is looking at these two men, dying. One dying, and you could say they both died as martyrs, but one died, literally fighting and shooting and stabbing and killing to defend the mission, and the other died carrying a monstrance in a Eucharistic procession, surrounded by. And I always was moved by the fact that when the Jeremy Irons character falls, the Portuguese soldier shoots him, and he drops the monstrance, that an Indian picks it up and starts walking. And I remember showing this to a Protestant friend years ago and saying, because they didn't understand what a monstrance was.
Right.
And I go, what's this thing he's carrying, right? And I go, well, that's, for Eucharistic adoration. And in it is the consecrated host. That's literally Jesus. And so in the end, Jeremy Irons dies literally following Jesus and leading the Indians and following Jesus in this procession.
Right.
And when he falls, the Indian picks it up and they continue to march behind Jesus until they're shot down. So you really have that sense of the history of the church, the martyrs, and how we face these times. And you have to ask, if you were in Nazi Germany, do you just deal with some martyrdom, or do you take up arms and be part of the resistance? And that's why I think this film has always been so interesting, because it raises these questions and it looks into these, has a profoundly Catholic take on them, but it raises universal questions for Christians and how we deal with our own sin, how we deal with opposition in this world, and what it means to be a Christian and operate in a fallen world. So, The Mission, 1986. You can find it on Amazon and Netflix and Apple TV and all that. Just search for it. Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, and highly recommend the film.
So, if we are going to do The Sound of Music, could we I need to work up to it. Could we put a couple in between?
Yeah, we can put a couple in between.
I got to
work you up to.
I got to prepare myself. I have to get my ultimate earworm fix is the song "Lowrider" by War. If you put that song, you know the song. Lowrider.
Yeah, I know the song. I just know why you're bringing this up at the end of this podcast.
Because I need to prepare. I need to listen to it over and over for weeks before I get into the music coming from it.
You have a long way to go, Ed.
I know.
I know. All right. Okay.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Yep.
Thank you for listening. My name is Greg Smith. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with others. And if you're curious about the Catholic worldview and faith, the Church and its saints, or Catholic history, culture, and art, then visit consideringcatholicism.com. and email me to let me know what you think. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com.